Im Sommer 2019 setzte das KünstlerInnenkollektiv Zollo eine Veranstaltungsreihe unter dem Titel There is no space um, mit der aus vielen Richtungen Fragen des Raumes diskutiert wurden. Der folgende Audiomitschnitt ist ein Gespräch zwischen Tamás und Pavlos Roufos, moderiert von Hannah Proctor. Es widmet sich der in der EU jüngst erweckten Beliebtheit der Frage nach nationaler Souveränität. Nähere Aufmerksamkeit gilt hierbei den aus linken Kreisen aufkommenden Forderungen nach Souveränität sowie selbigen vom rechten Rand. Das Gespräch fand in englischer Sprache statt.
Hello. Welcome everyone, and especially the three of you, to the second part of the program, There's No Space. I'm very happy you're all here, and also very happy the three of you are here. Thank you for coming. There's texts that come with the program today, and you find them in the bar, and you can take them if you feel like it. And also we there's two things going on today. One is the talk that we have now. There will be questions and answers afterwards. And we kind of thought that maybe this time it's good to make the questions and answers in a bit of a loose way. So after the three of you are done with your talk, everyone who feels like going more deep into one of the topics or one of the things that come up, we can maybe come a little closer together, but you also are free to take some drinks or some food or anything you like.
Hi, my name is Hannah Proctor. I'm going to moderate this discussion. I'm just going to very quickly introduce the two speakers who will be in conversation, and then I'll kind of ask a few questions along the way to keep us on track. And then, as you already said, we'll have a break, and then we can kind of reconvene for questions and answers. So I'm just going to read these quick bios that I took from the Facebook page. Thank you to Zollo for writing these. So first of all, Tamás is a Hungarian philosopher. He was a member of parliament and director of the Institute of Philosophy of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and has been a visiting fellow at the Institute for Wissenschaften von München in Vienna. His works have dealt with post-fascism, and the essay, one of the essays on the bar is an essay by him from 2000 on that subject. Also nationalism, ethnicism, class theory, and the aftermath of the collapse of really existing socialism. And Pavlos Roufos is doing research on ordoliberalism and German economic policy at the University of Kassel, and writes regularly about the Greek crisis and other incidents in political economy. He does that for Brooklyn Rail, and also in his book, A Happy Future is a Thing of the Past, which was published in 2018 by Reaction Books. So as you've probably seen, the overall kind of topic of this discussion is on national sovereignty. So I'll just begin by asking a very broad question, which would be, how would you, either of you, both of you, define that term?
Hi everyone. Thank you for coming. National sovereignty. I think the easiest way maybe to introduce for me the discussion around national sovereignty and nationalism would be to describe some incident from the social movements against austerity in Greece as a kind of an entry point for that. Because quite often people who were aware of what was happening in Greece would identify elements of nationalism or questions of national sovereignty in terms of like German-imposed austerity, this kind of like national narratives, or even in the context of the movements themselves, occasions of like possible fascist infiltration in the demonstrations in Syntagma Square specifically, or the existence of Greek flags during the demonstrations. That was kind of seen as an indication. My point of view is that these were not, this is kind of a false narrative, right? That was not the problem with nationalism during the movements in Greece. the presence of fascists is completely exaggerated, if existent at all, during the social movements, and the presence of national flags in the demonstrations was so insignificant that did not merit any kind of comment. We're talking about demonstrations of more than 300,000 people, in which there were 20 flags. It doesn't make a lot of sense to kind of focus on that. But nationalism did exist, or at least the national narrative did exist in those demonstrations, but it came from a different place. One example of that, the way I understood it, was, for example, during riots outside Parliament, when people were trying to stop the implementation and voting in of austerity measures, there were always like some people, not many, but there were like some people, and this is not just a Greek phenomenon, who would turn to the police and say, you should join us, we're all on the same side, right? This is a kind of quite common incident that you see quite a lot. And when I saw that, despite the many reasons why someone could get into that kind of state of mind, my question was always, so if we're all on this, if the police is on the same side as us, so who's on the other side, right? So that was always the question, like who's left? And from then on, if you start digging into that, you can end up in loads of different places. Most visibly, it was like Germany imposing something as a form of national humiliation. But then you can keep going all the way to anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that was a present thing, but that's kind of the implication. So the idea was that we created some kind of unifying whole against which was something kind of abstract. Not the fact that the police was there in order to make sure that the implementation of austerity would continue was not seen as a kind of direct kind of threat. It was seen as something that could potentially be on our side. And that sense of unifying argument was more developed, if you want, than by the left during those movements. So this is like kind of an incident of just random people saying crazy stuff to the police, but then that was developed by the left, which did adopt very much this national narrative of austerity as a national humiliation, treating those who implemented austerity or spoke in favor of it as traitors, right? That was a kind of a significant, so the people who did that were betraying something of that unifying kind of principle. And essentially, at the end of the day, calling for an understanding of the situation that we share a kind of common community with the same people who are actually implementing austerity. So we share something with the police, we share something with politicians, with trade unions. Anyone who was responsible at that point, any structure responsible for implementing austerity was meant to be within a shared community, and everything else on the outside, and that everything else was obviously quite abstract. And for me, that was the key problem and the key way through which ideas of national identity or national sovereignty were introduced in the movement. It wasn't from fascists, it wasn't from random people, it was from the left itself. And I'm gonna, end up with this kind of remark, and then we can.
So, without any further ado, let me just go straight to the subject. What is national sovereignty? National sovereignty is a term that has been deducted from the old term popular sovereignty, that is the main revolutionary idea in the West. What does it mean? Sovereignty is, after all, a term of political theology from the Middle Ages, in which royal power is being invested by divine anointment, and by its being conferred usually by the church. This is an idea that has something to do with the idea of empire, in the sense of Heiliges Römisches Reich der deutschen Nation, the medieval idea of dual power, church and reign, kingdom. And it means a title to dominate, a title to rule, and a title to be recognized as a dispenser of life and death. This has been replaced by the Great Revolution, by the French Revolution especially, by the ring of a series of great revolutions issuing from the idea of enlightenment, that sovereignty should be now vested in the people. What does it mean? If the people is sovereign, that means that nobody is sovereign over the people. So the original idea of popular sovereignty is the idea of equality. This is what it means, that no power is legitimate within the revolutionary system, as it was the Jacobin, socialist, etc. systems. Nobody can be above the people. There's no absolute title to rule. There's no absolute title to dispense life and death, good and bad, and so on, except by the subjects themselves. And this is why Jacques Rancière defines democracy as no rule. Democracy is not like it is defined currently as a concatenation of regulations, meaning, legal and legitimate rules of acquiring power, especially and normally through elections and such like. On the contrary, popular sovereignty and democracy, that is popular rule, presupposes no representation. There's no power without representation, as some of you who are artists may know that. Also, there's no representation without power. And also, the idea is that any kind of politics, any kind of power is rooted in the equality of citizens. That can be defined one way or another, and then, of course, the history of the left begins by the differences in the definition of equality. Nevertheless, the shift of meaning between popular sovereignty and national sovereignty, which is, of course, fraudulent, but very characteristic, namely that the subject of power, which should be everybody, vested into a mysterious entity, a kind of political community, the membership of which is defined by power. Maybe power is shared, that much remains from the original idea of popular sovereignty, but the definition of boundaries, the definition of frontiers, the definition of limits, metaphorically, politically, biologically, territorially, ethnically, culturally, denominationally, blah, 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 genderly, etc. Well, don't forget that after all, universal general suffrage was introduced in the first liberal country, Britain, in 1928. 1928. And in France, the democratic country par excellence, in 1945, okay? So, defining the nation is not something automatic. It is a question of power. And if the definition of who is entitled to exercise power and who is obliged to submit, if that problem is posed, then we cannot speak of any kind of democracy, we cannot speak of any kind of popular sovereignty, and the replacement of the idea of universal sovereignty, because no other way to imagine such a sovereignty, i.e. no sovereignty, popular power, no power, that's, well, after all, this is the revolutionary goal, and this is what remains the revolutionary goal, doesn't it? This is any kind of revolutionary endeavor in the tradition of the great revolutions aims at the dissolution and equal distribution and therefore the destruction of power. Power of people over others. Power of structures over subjects. Power of concepts over bodies, etc. Now you see, national sovereignty, therefore, means the investment with power of a group of people that is defined in various ways. Of course, there's democratic nationalism, in which all the citizens of a given polity are supposed to be the subject of power. various types of this. I won't go into that. But the important thing is that there's no way in which national sovereignty, parliamentary sovereignty, that's a term in official British constitutional doctrine. Who is the sovereign? Parliament. Well, at least this is clear. That means that it's not the people that is sovereign. That is the people's representatives, elected this way or that are exercising power, legitimate power, and therefore any kind of juggling with the idea of sovereignty is implicitly an attempt to limit sovereignty to some and not distribute it among all. Hence, it is an inegalitarian, hierarchical type of power. And with this begins the whole problematic of nationalism, of nation, but also of the state and so on and so forth. But let me just remind you, it's high time to be reminded, and reminding myself too, that the story of the bourgeois state and the bourgeois nation actually begins with the idea of its dissolution.
I wonder if I could ask Pavlos then to respond to this, particularly this kind of distinction between popular sovereignty and national sovereignty in relation to the kind of more specific context that you were discussing, or in relation to this more kind of longer genealogy of the term.
Well, I'm not going to say that much about the historical genealogy. I think more or less Gaspar covered it very well. What I would add, just as an addition to that, is the way Gaspar said, the notion of who is a member of that national community is an ongoing process. It's a historical process, and it is never quite finished in a way. And the way this process happens is kind of institutionally structured. So you have cultural, linguistic, religious, the different forms through which that kind of community is being created that gradually determine who becomes a member of that. In those different ways of understanding the kind of common elements that create this unity, what is quite striking to notice, and again, historically this is not coincidental, is that the one thing that is quite omnipresent in our societies, but is always missing as a unifying element, is the question of class, right? Class is never something that, because by definition, the distinctions between class do not allow for a national understanding of a common shared community, right? So class is never part of that discussion. And even if those structures that impose this kind of assimilation and create the idea of citizenship in a kind of republican sense, through culture and history and language, even those in themselves, they're quite contradictory, and they are a process of struggle. Nothing is considered like given in those. If you look, especially if you look at like the questions of culture, of history, of language, through the medium of class, you get a completely different description of each one of those. So the question of class is like always kind of missing, precisely because a class perspective is in direct contradiction with a kind of national idea, which is based on this kind of cross-alliance unification. And this, coming back in a certain way to Greece, and this is one of the things that was quite interesting in the way that the left approached, the official left, let's say. Most people would know Syriza, but they were not the only ones. That's the way they approached the whole idea, because what we had in Greece during those years was a almost complete collapse of all the mediating mechanisms that produced consensus in Greece in the previous years. So there was absolutely no trust towards political parties, towards parliament, towards trade unions, towards all those mediations that kind of produce consensus and make some kind of like social order possible. And one after the other, those institutional forms that are also responsible for creating this national shared community idea, and they were collapsing. So what the left was desperate to do from a certain point onwards, and it was quite clear, was to re-legitimize all those processes. So the adoption of a national narrative in Greece worked as a means of re-legitimizing all those mediations that were collapsing, but not in a kind of catastrophic manner, right? I have to add, they were collapsing in a very positive an interesting and creative way. Like people were trying to find ways of dealing with the questions of austerity, and that was being imposed in a way that was beyond those mediations. So they tried to do their own, from free healthcare clinics in terms of like a collapsing health system, all the way to attempts, however critical we may be, in some cases, attempts of replacing money as a main medium, right? So there were all these like little instances of things being done that were completely outside all these mediations, right? And at the same time, outside the notion of a national community, right? Because that was not the focus. The idea was more like, how do we deal with austerity at its source, to the extent that attacking the representation, so the parliament that was voting in for measures, if that was not successful because we were basically driven out by tear gas and police violence, what other ways are there to stop austerity at its source? And the forms that developed were very much different from this whole idea of accepting those structural mediations. And the left dedicated all its power to re-legitimize these ideas, right? These structures, to legitimize the idea that actually, if we have a proper government in power, they will actually be in a position to renegotiate and stop austerity. And that was the idea that was driving Syriza. And the reason they were successful was not so much that there was a continuation of the movements. As I described, it was kind of the opposite. It was more the idea that the movements had already failed for different reasons that we can discuss if you want. But the movements were over, and then 3 years later, you had eventually this kind of last minute, last chance. Maybe there might be something happening. But what they did in this context is precisely that, re-legitimize the idea of a shared national community represented through parliament, mediations, and all these structures that have to be reintroduced.
Thank you very much for reminding me of the class. Well, I should, writing about class all the time, but again, you see, there's a parallel development. I'm sure everybody among you has heard about the Abbé Sieyès. Good. He was an ideologist of the French Revolution, who had the famous pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? Qu'est-ce que le tiers état? And then the old revolutionary commonplace appears, but it was nothing, and it will be everything, because of course it was the non-nobles who were in the third estate. So when the feudal privileges, the birth privileges, that's the epitome of social injustice in human history. You are born into a privileged position without having earned it. That has been resisted for millennia. That was disestablished by the French Revolution. And then it was the term that everybody, especially the third estate, the commoners, the common man, okay, it's called in the American Revolution, was to be the nation. The idea of the nation is also a revolutionary idea, an emancipatory idea, which was meant to express the unity of equal citizens, capable of common action and capable of common feeling. That was the original idea of the nation, as opposed to later developments about which you know enough, I suppose. So therefore, again, the extension of power and extinction of power was the essence, even in this respect, of all the movements that originated in the Enlightenment. And that was also, of course, the idea of the Austrian and German Enlightenment that has been operated not revolutionary way, but from above by the monarchy. And also it was generalized by none other than Immanuel Kant, who in his famous work, Eternal Peace, has said that the peace, that is a civilized and cooperative relationship of human groups, is assured that if every single particular state will be a republic, today it will be called a rule of law regime, that is, in which arbitrary rule and arbitrary hierarchy based on birth privilege and on religious intolerance does not obtain. So this is how the whole thing has started. It has started, like many other things, as an attempt at liberation. So this is why nationalism is not from the inception something evil. On the contrary, it was an instrument of liberation. What happened to it is another problem.
But perhaps we should talk a little bit about the other problem insofar as... So it's interesting to think, that at its inception, the nation wasn't this kind of... may have had this kind of emancipatory ideas at its basis. But today, when we hear the terms left nationalism, it seems to have a very different kind of tenor or agenda. So I wondered if maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we move away from Greece for a moment, and because people know what happened there, more or less. Like Syriza was elected, there was enthusiasm, and then it was all over, and then nobody spoke about it anymore because I think, especially for the international left, it was kind of embarrassing to look at what happened in Greece in the aftermath of that great victory. But what is noticeable today, especially in Europe, is how these ideas of like national sovereignty and regaining control over like whatever it is, the economy, the state, the popular will, or whatever, they have been extrapolated and appear in different like parts of Europe in the form of a kind of left-wing anti-EU nationalism. These people would never call themselves nationalists, right? They would reject that, but any kind of like careful attention to what they're saying makes it clear that this is exactly what we're talking about. Because what they're posing against the so-called neoliberal imperatives of the European Union and the Eurozone is precisely the regaining of national sovereignty, the regaining of control. What is interesting in a way to note is that these kind of tendencies were never gained a critical mass in any of the countries that was so much hit by austerity. So the peripheral countries of the Eurozone, like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, that went through all these experiences, the notion of being like straight anti-EU, anti-European and monetary union, the idea of exiting, like Brexit or whatever exit you want to call it, never managed to get any kind of support. And I would say just briefly for the simple reason that it was kind of impossible to convince people, thankfully, I would say in a way, to convince them that what is being used as the worst threat for not following the conditions of the bailout mechanism. So if you do not follow austerity, this is what's going to happen. And that was exit of the Eurozone. So the idea of convincing people that what was being presented as the worst threat is actually the best kind of possible solution, it was kind of like contradictory, it never really caught on. Plus people had the kind of the intelligence to understand that a sudden drop of like your purchasing power and your ability to access certain things that you consider to be part of your life and what gives meaning to that life, losing that access for some reason could not be equated with some kind of emancipatory position. But the one place where these kind of arguments, not necessarily from the left, but with many similarities, there is a left faction supporting that, but it's mostly a right-wing argument. The one place where it seems to have gained some kind of momentum is the UK, with Brexit, right? So in Brexit, the whole argument was based on taking back control. Those are the things that you will hear. Stopping the EU from like regulating and whatever, using all that money that was supposedly sent to the EU in order to fund the NHS. These were the arguments. National sovereignty, all these kind of positions. So in that case, this was the only part where, this kind of argumentation resonated more, and it resulted in a political transformation which we haven't seen the last, not even close, but we're very close to seeing what kind of consequences this will have in the case of the UK. And it was mostly, and it's kind of undeniable, and it became more clear, a right-wing position, and very closely linked to the question of migration, right? That was the key thing around Brexit. And that is something which is interesting because there is no conceivable way of talking about national sovereignty without speaking about national borders, without implying that certain people are on the outside and certain people on the inside. So whether we talk about the right or the left, the understanding of regaining sovereignty meant that the situation, the economic situation, the political situation, the social situation within that territory that has been chosen would be improved by delinking itself from any kind of external outside influence, whether that was capital flows, global capital, or whether it was the flows of humans, right? Human migration. So these things were very often conflated. The idea that there's free capital movement around Europe because of the EU was very much equated with free movement of migrants towards the EU. So those two things, whether from the right or the left, became kind of the focus of that kind of campaign. And this is the only case where we have a successful, to a certain extent, on its own kind of understanding, implementation of that kind of mentality.
Well, left nationalism has always existed. It's still a very contradictory and interesting phenomenon, but let me tell you that what we are dealing with today is not nationalism, and it's quite beyond the point that in an essay I call this ethnicism. It's just a word. But what I mean by this is that any kind of supra-ethnic political entity is increasingly lacking legitimacy in the eyes of the public opinion. It's a long story, starting in really seriously with, of course, with National Socialism and Fascism, that has recognized only the biopolitical and the cultural component of a political community, and therefore operated differences within that political community by withdrawing citizenship from former members of the political community. And therefore, this is a rejection of the abstraction state. The state has been always established as something from or over or with citizens, equal citizens. That's its notion. The modern state, as I try to describe it, it is about citizenship. It's about a relationship, a power relationship between or over equal citizens, supposed to be equal citizens. Now, fascism and similar racism and similar views about politics are rejecting the idea of nation as the idea of a political community, of an equal political community within a given territorial and political and military and economic framework as they were traditionally defined in modern states and are again defined. So all these supra-ethnic structures, be they nation states or federations or international organizations, have seen their legitimacy, recognition, and authority withdrawn. The destruction of structures such as the EU and the United Nations, UNESCO, ILO, etc., that are collapsing today, and the whole system of international treaties and conventions and covenants and so on. It started first with the destruction of supra-ethnic nation states such as Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and now next probably it will be Britain, but that's a characteristic East European state in many ways. I recognize many things. Actually, 2 weeks ago, the Albanian Prime Minister mark my words, the Albanian Prime Minister has said that the House of Commons reminds him of the Bosnian Parliament. He's quite right, yes, it reminds me too. But it's not only the comical side of it, but a total lack of conceptual logical unity of procedures that has been lost. That is, of course, at the basis of any kind of jurisprudence, any kind of legal arrangement. We are rule-driven societies. In absence of real power for the citizens, we substitute rules. Rule of law, isn't it? Rule of law, that's the positive idea. That's the liberal democracy. Of course, liberal democracy in this, Viktor Orban, my excellent prime minister, is quite right that this is a contradiction in terms, because if there is a social order called democracy that has to be entrusted not to the citizens but to legal structure, well, that's no democracy, there's something else. Anyway, but so what happens is that all these non-ethnic structures are unraveling. What did the radical left begin the construction of its statehood? The first state that had no territorial, geographical, or ethnic word in its name was the Union of the Socialist Council Republics, also known as the Soviet Union. The national anthem of the Soviet Union at the beginning, of course Stalin changed that, was the Internationale. The national motto of the Soviet Union was "Proletarians of all countries unite." Hence, in the original idea of the Soviet Union, it was the principle of its dissolution and of its suppression, of its Aufhebung. Yeah? And so the left, by definition, is internationalist. Not as internationalist because leftist people don't have ethnic and cultural feelings and so on, and won't weep in their glass of wine, singing patriotic songs as Karl Marx has done. Yes, he was a very sentimental German patriot, as a private person. Also the author of the Communist Manifesto that said that the proletarians have no home, keine Heimat, and that the difference between the Communist Party and all the other workers' parties is that the Communist Party represents the interest of all proletarians, not of the proletarians of one country. Proletarians of all countries unite, hooray. Okay. But yes, but that is, why is that? Why is internationalism such a conspicuous and important part of the left identity by which you can finally recognize the left? Because, of course, it is a consequence of the primary commitment of the historical left as being opposed to power and being opposed to oppression and being opposed to hierarchy. The supposition that there are differences in rank, in dignity, in honor, etc. between people is the immediate enemy of all revolutionary, all insurgent, all rebellious movements. That's the main tradition of the left. And the nation as such, nation state and so on, and especially ethnic superiority and racism, presuppose such a hierarchy. That's the immediate direct enemy of the left. When the left is becoming nationalist, which has happened time and time again, is only because of the hypothesis that the enemy of the common folk, of the oppressed, of the downtrodden, is some sort of international cabal, international organization, international interest, and beyond the internationality of capitalism that is strictly mirrored by the internationality of the proletariat. The proletariat is international, and its main adversary, capitalism, is international also. This is a conflict that is independent of national conflicts. But of course, left nationalism is a protest against other cases, other instances of oppression, especially of the colonial kind, and so on and so forth. And whether it is really reasonable to think that the dissolution of an international organization such as the European Union or the United Nations can serve the cause of the downtrodden, well, this is an open question. We have seen nation states, sovereign nation states, oppressing in the most terrible way the workers and other subaltern classes. And so we have seen international arrangements doing the same, from international empires to the Soviet Union under Stalin and so on and so forth. So therefore, I think that we should proceed on a case-to-case basis in judging who is the political subject we identify with and defend, who is the main target of exploitation, and where is the main adversary. But to say that it's a general fact that international organizations and supranational and supraethnic structures are more oppressive than ethnic structures ignores one of the most important historical experiences of the 20th century, and I'm speaking of the Third Reich. So you can't, it's ridiculous to suppose that international and supraethnic institutions as such, from the point of view of oppression, of servitude and so on, are by definition superior, which any nationalism will, of course, assume. So I don't think that any kind of truly effective long-term left nationalism is allowed to exist, by history, not by me, by history, and which doesn't mean that we should not, on the contrary, fight against racial and ethnic oppression. Recognizing the special interests, say, of the blacks in the United States in the 19th century doesn't mean nationalism, but it means an attack on white nationalism. And that's not the same, and that's not the same. And so this is why I think that left nationalism is a contradiction in terms, but it can appear when defending the weak against the strong, the poor against the rich. Of course, some of these contrasts are indeed national. Strong states are, oppressing the weak, large states the small, old states the new, etc., etc. And in the interest of equality, of course, a political fight is indicated, but if it's only a fight for a superiority for a group hitherto oppressed instead of non-oppression, then it may be nationalist, but most certainly it wouldn't belong to the left. Sorry for being so dogmatic, but...
I wonder, are you operating with a slightly different definition of nationalism then, that would... Or is it that, or maybe not you, but maybe the one that you were kind of glossing, that would describe itself as nationalist, wouldn't define the nation as super ethnic, because it would be based on some fantasy of kind of racial purity or something that obviously isn't really about the nation, but is about some kind of... Do you see the kind of contradiction? I
think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say, I think Gaspar's distinction between nationalism defined as a kind of republican citizenship arrangement in contrast to ethnicism is an extremely useful category, right? At the same time, I would say they're much more interconnected with each other as it sometimes sounds. I think nationalism, the way I kind of spoke about it, at least in the beginning, as an attempt to have a cross-class alliance and a unifying principle within a specific territory, doesn't necessarily, although it can be compatible with, it does not necessarily imply citizenship. And Gaspar knows that he has written about it, so I'm not making any kind of interesting criticism here. It's more like, even in the cases where you had countries that did have this kind of, even in the abstract, equality between citizens, as a kind of like precondition for that political community, there were somehow members of that community that were excluded. So in the case of the colonies, for example, you had France that could have been seen in a formally democratic republican citizenship way. Of course, the colonial subjects were not part of that arrangement. In the same way, Native American also excluded, and there are many examples like that. So there's always some kind of distinction. Even this idea of membership, as we kind of said before, is an ongoing process. So whether it ever reached that ideal republican citizenship, I think not, right? And in that sense, I'm not sure if nationalism is in the decline, I would say, in one sense. I think that there's a pivoting between ethnicism and nationalism. I think ethnicism is a more extreme form of that, with some distinctions. If I return to the question of the left and left nationalism, because Caspar mentioned that it's a contradiction in terms, I think in a certain way it's true, to the extent that the left has historically, or has fought historically, at least certain parts of the left, to identify themselves with a class perspective and an internationalist kind of idea. It is also true that historically large parts of the left have been driven by national identification. Social democracies would be the obvious example of that historical formation. And even though today you could say that there is no specific future, because even those moments of left nationalism that we see today, anti-EU, even in the peripheral countries of the Eurozone, even though, as I said before, they're not particularly successful in mobilizing people, that is true. And in that sense, you could say they don't really have a future. At the same time, I would say what we see is more kind of like a morphing, because the more the arguments and the methodology of thinking about the world of these sides is developed, the more they resemble right-wing arguments. So on the one hand, it's not at all rare to see people who start from a left progressive position gradually, transforming into like vile kind of nationalist things. I think you already have that kind of transformation happening right now. There are people speaking about anti-EU left nationalism. They constantly say that migration is not really their issue, but at the same time you hear constantly from the left, and this is from the United States all the way to Europe, you hear people saying that migration, which is I think the key way of understanding the limitation of this kind of national sovereignty idea, migration is either projected as a neoliberal plot, right? This idea that it's the Koch brothers, that's what Bernie Sanders famously said, is the Koch brothers' plan to have open borders, right? It is not something that belongs to the left. And you hear, so migration is presented as either that, or in a more kind of straightforward way, it's seen as a burden against the limited resources of welfare, right? Or as a downward pressure towards wages. So these are the three ways that the left, and the right has done that before, of course, but the left today, left nationalists, are tackling the issue of migration while saying that migration is not our issue. So they're presenting it like that, right? And what is obvious when somebody looks at those kind of arguments is that the only way you can conceptualize such an argumentation against migration is if you presuppose that migrants are not part of the class, right? Because if they are part of the class, you cannot imagine having that same argumentation. It is only because they're excluded, they're not part of this national category that includes those who deserve welfare, the people who should have some kind of legal protection and mediation from the state or trade unions. They're not part of that. They cannot be defended, so they should be excluded. And it's interesting to notice sometimes, because now the argument that migration is pushing wages down, that's a very kind of common argument. It doesn't matter whether it's real or not, right? The simple way for me to kind of to show how absurd it is as an argument, if you claim to have a class perspective, is to simply replace the term migrants with women and look back 50 or 70 years. Because the same arguments that are used today against migrants were used in the past against women entering the labor force. Because that was the same economic argument. They were going to bring down wages, they're willing to... Exactly, yeah. or also that the introduction of women in the labor force was a plot by capital. A lot of official working class organizations use those arguments and trade unions in order to say that introducing women is going to be, is an idea that capital is trying to impose in order to blah, blah, blah. The same exact argument. And if you do that today, I mean, nobody, even, in the left, and however provocative they might be, nobody would imply that women should actually be excluded from the workforce because they bring down wages, right? It would not fit any kind of idea of emancipation, whatever people would like to claim for themselves. Although I just now saw a video of Wolfgang Streeck who said exactly that thing. But so we wouldn't be surprised, but it is actually, up until now, I thought that wasn't going to be part of the argument, but it seems that it has.
One thing about migration, but in parentheses, of course, if you think about, from the idea of the Union of the Socialist Soviet Republics to the Nationale Volksarmee, that's very interesting that a so-called socialist state would call its army in that way, not only national, but also folk. Wonderful. That was, I don't know whether you know that, in East Germany, that was the official name of the army, Nationale Volksarmee. But that's in parentheses. And about migration, the problem of migration as it is posed, it is indeed the greatest provocation for the present social order anywhere. Because you see, the pretense of the present order, allegedly democratic and liberal and blah, 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 is that although there is a difference between the human condition and the civic condition, not every human being is a citizen. It's a very interesting assumption if you think about it. Why the hell not? But okay, because nobody is assured of being born in a place that will dispense citizenship to people such as he or she. Isn't that the re-establishment of birth privilege and of pre-modern hierarchy on an international scale? It is. And you see, the aim, even contained in such boring documents read by nobody, like the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of the man and of the citizen, that an approximation will have to take place between the idea of the human being and the idea of the citizen, between the human condition and the political condition. That anybody and everybody should be subject to decisions that affect him or her. That would be the idea of freedom, of legal freedom, that liberals, in principle, will subscribe to, okay? And when there were previous instances, but if in such a case as this migration crisis, that is the intention of a large number of people to escape intolerable conditions and move elsewhere and claim their universal birthright to be recognized as human beings and as participants of a political community in a place where they have been forced to go by circumstances beyond their control, war, famine, what have you. And this is refused to them by everybody, from fascists to moderate liberal conservatives and to alleged Marxists in some left-wing parties, if I'm not very much mistaken. But I don't want any mixture in the internal affairs of the Federal Republic of Germany, and especially of the Linkspartei. No. And no, that would be totally alien to my general practice. And but it is the first lie I'm saying tonight. Yes. I hope the last two. Well, mistakes, errors, yes. Well, lies, that's different. And you see, so these people are coming here to our shores and saying, is it true that the human condition is a universal condition? Is it true? And we are all responding to them, no. So, of course, the migrant crisis is not causing the ultimate crisis of bourgeois liberal states and rule of law regimes, but is a symptom. Of course, it's sharpening it and radicalizing it, but it's a symptom of their original ambiguity and hypocrisy, and also of their deterioration, even from them hypocritical and ambiguous and ambivalent and far from perfect way in which they existed in the golden days of the welfare state and of Adenauer and all that beautiful era. Anyway, and the thing is, you see, that we are confronted with a questioning of the real foundations of this society. Well, in such circumstances, historically, the left was responding by saying, you see how hypocritical, mendacious, low down and disgusting the social order is? Well, let's change it, comrades. Okay, let's found a new world in which such things won't be produced. In the present, the left, in its ultimate weakness, says not this. It says, oh, liberals, aren't you lying? Why don't you realize those promises in which you have believed and about which Karl Marx was writing in 1843 that they were total, absolute lies. So we are at the moment, we on the left, not in the position of revolutionaries or of rebels, but of complainants, of people presenting Beschwerden, and requests, saying, oh, Frau Merkel, what are you doing? Didn't you really mean that we'll do that? We'll schaffen es. So now don't you? So as though the left would be the good conscience of its enemy, the bloody bourgeois state. I mean, what kind of left is this? Pitiful. But that's what I'm doing too. I mean, of course, that's not that I'm not reproaching anybody else. I'm writing, flaming articles in the moderate bourgeois press, showing exactly this, that all these states are just big liars and fascist at heart and all that kind of stuff, as if I really believed in the excellence and purity of the liberal state, which of course I don't. And, but of course I'm forced by circumstances at least to complain, at least to criticize, which is not historically and politically and morally what a self-conscious radical left, and no other left is possible, can or should do. So they are not. The weakness will induce falsehood. That's why it is tragic. This weakness is bad in itself. Who the hell wants to triumph? That's not it. The work of liberation is not about that. So weakness in itself is nothing bad, but the secondary consequences of political weakness are exactly this: that people, such as myself and many others, have to accept a logic that is alien to our fundamental commitments and beliefs, in order to be able to help people who are being mistreated, are being tortured, are drowning in the Mediterranean, who are not given to eat at the Hungarian-Serbian border. Do you know that people at that border are being given to eat? In each and every case, the NGOs have to go to Strasbourg to the European Court of Human Rights that will make a verdict in the case of that individual that he has to be fed. And in every case, so the Hungarian Helsinki Committee has, a court case about feeding people, about, 10 cases a week, because the government does not accept that such judgments have a precedent value. So they will give some rights to Mustafa, but they won't give any rights to Ali. And so therefore, can I remain silent? Of course not. How can one speak? By accepting the very principles that have caused this situation. Okay? That, you can't get any lower than that. That's really terrible. That's really terrible. And I feel very intensely about that. And of course, humanitarian conscience will drive me to do this. But of course, I know that I'm not totally sincere, which is awful. Yeah. And this is the situation of many politicians and journalists and writers and thinkers and so on, because we are weak. So the solution is, of course, not to be so weak, okay? And to... Well, first of all, there are intellectual methods for that. Clarifying, being strict, being unmerciful, being very strict to ourselves, trying to, at least, even if we have few, to be clear about what our duties and what our possibilities are, both, and they don't coincide, unfortunately. And also, of course, to gather forces, and to realize that what is the left in the service of? To speak like Dostoevsky, who is not exactly a leftist. Yes. Okay.
Do you have a response to this kind of what is to be done question and kind of praxis?
That would be great. That would be great.
Yes, I have the solution.
Yeah, I do actually.
Here it is, comrades.
I'm not going to tell you yet, right? Because you're not ready.
Be discreet.
Well, yes, I think the first thing would be to recognize that weakness, right? And to understand, and not pretend, as the left is very used to doing in the last few years, to kind of go after celebrity of like left-wing, revitalization, and then forget about it 2 months later without any kind of... So I think we have to be clear that we do start from a point of weakness. But I think what is also important is to keep in mind that we should always resist making a virtue out of necessity. So making that weakness the starting point and the last point of your understanding of the world, of your critique. This is, again, something that the left is doing. The official left is basically taking the crystallized forms of the failures of the past and trying to extrapolate them into the future by saying, well, if something like that mobilized something, people in the past, it might as well give us like votes, because that is essentially how the official left understands its own power. It is not simply about destroying the kind of the positions of the left, the way they appear, the way they have been criticized today. Because, we have to be aware that there is a moment of weakness, and weakness does not give birth to specific things. At the same time, if we're not clear about where this weakness comes from, what's the responsibility of the left itself in producing that weakness historically? So look at the past, look at what kind of mistakes were made, what kind of limitations were reached in previous movements. That would be another quite important thing. And also, it would be quite necessary to always remain critical towards things as they're being presented. To always remain critical about the idea that in the face of weakness, we are forced to defend the existing system against its kind of aberrations and against its kind of, weird excesses, right? So it's never an idea of defending that, but it is quite important and historically has been proven so, to keep strengthening in any possible way those moments that have a clear emancipatory potential in opposition to anything that becomes more divisive, that becomes, at the end of the day, inhuman, right? So any kind of opportunity we have to do that, I think would be a good starting point. Where it would take us, I don't know. And I would say a self-critical perspective is also quite necessary. I mean, Gaspar mentioned this moment of Marx crying over a glass of wine with patriotic songs. I think there's something funny and there's something true about that moment, because any kind of sense of nationalism, whether it's institutionalized, whether it's imposed, whether it's based on some kind of division that if you dig into you would find unacceptable, there is a kind of background in all the way back that has an element of truth, which is everyone needs somehow to feel a sense of community. Everyone has the need somehow to live in an environment where, as Werner says in this really nice text, where things tell you stories, right? That you're somewhere that you can identify, right? And more particularly your own stories, the ones of your surrounding friends, loved ones, and that is quite important. But I think the key thing, and this is what I find like fantastic in this text, and which I suggested to hand out, is that Werner turns that around and says that this kind of comfort that everyone feels the need somehow, this kind of communal sense against isolation, alienation, it is not a given. It is not a given of history, it is not a given, it's not a specific property that is given to us. It is instead, he says, a historical bet. So it's something that we have to create. It is not something that, if you fall back into tradition, into common language, into common history, into national borders, if you fall back to any of those things that present themselves as unifying principles, that is not what you will get. What you will get will be horror at the end of the day, right? So instead of falling back into that, to trying to find that comfort that is a human need, you need to kind of create that as a historical bet. I would end like that.
I'll ask one thing, and then I think we should have a break. So the text that's been printed and left on the bar is your text on post-fascism, which was published in the year 2000, which in many ways maybe seems like quite a different historical moment and quite a different sort of historical conjuncture, but actually many of the things that you outline there do also just seem very prescient. And I wondered to what extent you would say that the moment that we're in now is in a kind of direct continuity with that, whether you would still define this as a kind of post-fascist moment in the same way, or whether you think that there is something kind of new and distinctive about the present kind of configuration.
This is the classic case when one wishes that one is not right. And so that essay has recognized before other similar writings by others, some features of the shape of the new capitalist state after the demise of the welfare state in the West and after its twin in the East, called socialism for various historical reasons that have very little to do with this reality. It was real enough, but not so socialist. Real existent, but not so socialist. But certainly believed to be that. And it was certainly an egalitarian attempt against certain types of privilege and of inequality. That much has to be recognized. But anyway, those things have been wiped out. And the crystallization of a new political structure to be adequate to this new situation, in which the common ideas of both blocs during the Cold War, don't forget that both the American-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc shared and Enlightenment genealogy. Technology, progress, raising living standards, making more comfort, more equality, more health, more education, etc., etc. All these progressive developments ushered in by state action and by conscious bureaucratic action based on social science and on technology and other science, were in common our shared values of both systems, and so on and so forth. It was, lights, not darkness. It was not backward-looking romanticism, but progressivism, and so on and so forth. That's gone. So when, in '89, the East European so-called socialist system collapsed, who were ideologically in control in the West? Do you remember at all? Those conservatives who said and thought very seriously around Mrs. Thatcher and her government and in the American radical right and so on and so forth that inspired the Reagan governance and so on and so forth, that basically liberalism was obsolete, that the ideas of state-assisted progress towards greatest welfare and greatest happiness were obsolete, and that the needs of the populace, as expressed by the usual methods, shouldn't be attended to. Those will be satisfied by liberty, by which they meant the market, etc., etc. So therefore, the whole conceptual framework of citizenship went, just disappeared by that time. And in Eastern Europe, including, of course, not so eastern places such as the Czech Republic and East Germany, accepted that henceforward nobody will look after people. It will be exactly nobody who will look after people. They will have to look after themselves. It is, individuality is interpreted in a sense of the accidental or serendipity of the random, as it's expressed by anonymous, impersonal market forces. And so then, what was there? It was a very radical change. In many ways in Eastern Europe, a change from an opposite to another opposite. What was the only thing in which people could find some sort of solid grip on something that seemed helpful? Well, it was themselves as expressed by race, as defined not intellectually, not conceptually, not rationally, but biopolitically, bodily. We are white, etc., etc. We come from this place and the other. Our ancestors were Protestant or Catholic, etc. All these kind of things that are part of the self-definition of an individual in a bourgeois liberal society that are absolutely secondary, because a bourgeois liberal society, in principle, neglects these elements to the advantage of the abstraction of citizenship and of economic competition and of political competition, electoral, etc. So that wasn't the liberal society that has been offered by the propaganda to the East Europe. It was already beyond it. So it was race that remained, and it was race mostly that was the defining element of belonging to a political community. I mean, look around you. This is the victorious idea. We are Europeans by the virtue of being white, of being born here, etc., etc., by virtue of our individuality as it was formed empirically by the accident of birth, origin, etc., etc., generation. And so to enforce this, you mean that you have to abandon citizenship in the sense of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, American Revolution, etc., etc. Fabian socialism, all that moderate thing that dominated Europe for such a long time. And this can be done without any totalitarian power, any death camps, any Gestapo raids, anything of that, because racial discrimination and misrecognition of citizenship can proceed without resistance. Why can it proceed without resistance? Why was National Socialism and fascism in the original classical form so sanguinary? Because it had an opponent, and that opponent was communism. They had to annihilate communism to reintroduce birth privilege and inborn hierarchy. So they had to destroy the most important emancipatory force in modern history, that was socialism, both in its social democratic and its communist and other smaller things guise. Well, this is not the case any longer. This is a united world. On the whole canvas, you don't find the contrary forces. You don't find the revolutionary forces. There's no need for terror, because socialism was beaten anyway. What has happened in Europe from the 1920s to the 1970s? It was the defeat of socialism in Western Europe. And to this, the Soviet Union has contributed through the system of mutual balance, mutual deterrence, Cold War, peace, peaceful coexistence. These are different names for the same reality, i.e. don't do nothing. And so all that has disappeared. There's no alternative to capitalism. This is a world in which there's no real alternative to capitalism. They can be imagined, they're very important and valid, but still imaginary and conceptual alternative to capitalism, but no real alternative to capitalism. Therefore, it is post-fascism that can be content with peaceful methods in introducing, from economic inequality always existent in capitalist society, linked to the birth privilege of the olden times, which was always the dream of the Nazis. To institute differences between groups of people according to their origins. And this is what is being imposed in a comparatively mild way and non-sanguinary way, but increasingly sanguinary if you think about the victims at the borders, but certainly not mass graves yet. But wars and such things, of course, multiply and is increasingly dangerous. Nevertheless, within the so-called developed world itself, there's no mass murder and such things. It's not necessary. The aims at which fundamentally fascism was aiming at, i.e. reversing the advances operated by the Enlightenment, that's it. They wrote about it. Old German conservatives, before the First World War and in the moment of revolution. Are you aware of the fact that 2 books have appeared in Berlin in the autumn of 1918? The Spirit of Utopia by Ernst Bloch and The Decline of the West by Spengler. Isn't it? So, Spengler was not a Nazi, but it was quite clear that what were the famous ideas of 1914, so famous in Germany. Even Thomas Mann believed in them in the Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen. It was the anti-Enlightenment idea, the idea opposed to the French Revolution, which was the idea of civic equality. And that has been reversed, and that is being reversed again without the need for death camps. So yes, unfortunately, I think that it's an imperfect essay, but I think that the main intuition was proved right, and I wish it wasn't, but it is. And, this basically is our weakness to the secret of the strength of the opponent, obviously.
Okay, so we'll have a break. You just sort of described in the introduction how you envisaged the Q&A, so maybe you want to say what you have in mind.
Okay. No, I don't know. We were just thinking since last time Q&A were quite. There was no air in the space anymore, so they were quite stiff. We kind of thought that this time we have a little break, everyone can get a drink or some food, and then those that feel like it gather here again in maybe 10 minutes. Something like that.